Yoga Without Borders was born, I think, in 2002, just before George W. Bush declared war. And then in 2003, when he did declare war, I declared peace. And from that day forward, we began to meditate every day for peace. Now, for years earlier, I'd been engaged in various service and activist projects, and I'd encourage my students to do that and set up projects for them to do locally and internationally, but never on this scale. And then in 2003, from this meditation, we began to do more intense type of work. And about 2.5 years ago, I started a leadership training program for some of the key students and teachers who work with me in the early morning hours. The practice of global sadhana is at 4 o'clock in the morning. So the people who could sustain that were doing leadership training with me, and each of them gradually develops an initiative within Yoga Without Borders to help eradicate violence towards women and girls permanently in our lifetime and worldwide. So the first one was Maggie Thompson-Hayes, who developed a program that went to Haiti after the earthquake. Then my colleague Angit Kaur developed a program to deal with female genital mutilation, which has evolved into a Celebrate Her, which is health, education, and rights. Bill Thomas, another one of my colleagues who meets us at 4 o'clock in the morning, all very experienced yoga teachers and practitioners. He's developed Fathers Speak Out, which is a network of men and sons, boys and adult men, speaking up and speaking out on this subject. And every few weeks, as new people are joining the program, new initiatives are born. This summit is part of that. The idea of, I asked Salima to put this together and create this Yoga Without Borders organization and summit, and to start building a strategy over 2 years so that we would actually have something concrete and we could get behind it and not just talk about the problem, which I'm encouraging people to do first of all, but to solve the problem and get it done through direct action, intervention. We're not laid back. There's a tendency sometimes for people who meditate a lot or work on themselves a lot, which is a beautiful thing to do, to sometimes get too self-aware. And then that's why I say we've moved away from the consciousness of enlightening the self to the consciousness of enlightening everybody. Not with a particular way, but the idea that it's not just one person, it's now everybody. So we begin by taking something that has to be dealt with, which is the unseen, the unspoken. And the unseen and unspoken is not ghosts, it's not a magical universe, it's hundreds of millions of women and girls. It's hard to imagine it. It's hard to imagine this. I myself didn't know about this on this scale until I went to a lecture with Stephen Lewis. And Stephen Lewis is one of Canada's gems. He is a very outspoken man, very courageous man, and built an organization around his activism and service. And when I heard him speak along with Eve Ensler, I was very moved, because I thought, how could I not know about this, the scale of this? This is incredible. And at the end, he was asked, what can we do? I just assumed he would say, give us money or write your MP. And he said, talk about it. So that evening, I began talking about it. I was on the radio, doing one of my normal shows on the radio, and I started talking about it. And the next morning, as I was leading my program in the yoga and meditation, I started talking about it. And from that point forward, I asked everybody to talk about it. And from that grew these initiatives and this specific organization and network. This is the hardest part of this subject. You know, we can talk about many things in the world, because there are so many things that we can try to fix. But did you know that there were hundreds of millions of girls who were mutilated every year? I didn't know this.
Yeah.
Did you know that the scale of mass rape in some countries, it's unimaginable. It's not simply a question of domestic violence, which is bad enough, or the staggering percentages of women who will be assaulted in their lifetime, but the numbers of women who strategically are raped as part of war, not the after effect of war, but before the battle. And this has now become a new strategy of war. And the numbers are unimaginable. The new strategy of war is you rape the women first on a mass scale. It happens in Africa especially. And the numbers are staggering. Because it happens in Africa, we don't think about it, and whether we like to think of ourselves as enlightened or not, there is a lot of racism still. We tend to think of Africa as far away, and it's those people, and the reality is they're here, we're there. There is no more disconnect. We can't live that way anymore. It's not true. And the numbers are unimaginable. Slavery, which we thought slavery was abolished 200 years ago, slavery is not at the highest it's ever been. There are more slaves in the world today than there have ever been. It's the number one business in the world today, bigger than oil. The numbers are unbelievable. And yet here we are in Toronto, and for us, if female genital mutilation happens, we're horrified. It's against the law. We want to put someone in jail. But in other places, it's 100 million girls. There's a difference between long-term shifting of consciousness and immediate emergency. Now, I like to compare this to World War II, even though people can't remember it anymore. But here's an example. In World War II, anti-Semitism was very prevalent. And it still is. It's a long-term process. But concentration camps had to be stopped. We didn't take time and say, look, we need to talk about anti-Semitism, and before we talk about homosexuality and Judaism and Jehovah's Witness and dissidents in our culture, as we discuss this over time, we will evolve. No, we actually went in and said, whoa, while we're having those discussions, the concentration camps have to stop. And we found that 6 million people had been killed. Jehovah's Witnesses, people who were Jewish, homosexuals, dissidents were killed. So what did we do? We separated the ongoing process from the immediate emergency. And that's what I'm asking everybody to do now. It's very easy to think about, well, men and women, there's violence. We have domestic violence too. We need to deal with the core of this and get to, the sexism. Yes, but in the meantime, there's an emergency happening. And she wrote the Vagina Monologues. She's an actress and playwright, and what an incredible thing she's done for women. And she traveled to Africa to expose so much, but it ate away at her. It was really hard to see, hard to deal with. But she talked about it, and she started writing about it and telling women about it and making demands and meeting with people to start organizing. I was lucky enough to see her and to be inspired by her and Stephen Lewis. And now I want to do what he said to do, which is first let's talk about it, then let's take a stand, and let's be of service. It's unseen for a few reasons. One is that it's really unpleasant to talk about. It's really hard to talk about. Yeah. Your mind goes blank after a while. Second thing, it's women. And we just haven't reached a point in this world yet where women are really respected enough. We have to stop this now, because this is, as you said, I'm going to use this word a lot now, this is a Holocaust.
You can totally take that.
And this is, we're not talking anymore about, gee, is this a philosophy and is this a political movement of women gradually gaining more rights or becoming president of the United States or somewhere else. We're talking about the mass rape, mutilation, sale of women and little girls all over the world. Now, there are suburbs here in Toronto that are considered centers for this slave trade. Right here, right in the GTA. There are people right here in the GTA who participate in this, but the scale is not the same. We don't have 100 million people here. In other parts of the world, they do. And we can't ignore it. So we gradually take a stand. Now, the first thing we're asking everybody to do is to read, declare, sign, and share these proclamations that came from this group of women. The second thing we're asking everybody to do, as I keep saying over and over and over again, is to keep talking about it. Because just the conversation you and I are having, it's hard to talk about, it sort of blows your mind, but we can't ignore it, so no. The only way to not ignore it is to talk about it. Talk about it at lunch, talk about it at dinner, talk about it in a conversation every single day. Keep bringing it up, even though it's uncomfortable, even though people sort of go blank and turn off and turn pale, still keep talking about it in the course of a day. And the third is participate in the unification of our intention here to take more action. That's the idea. We need to unify this because the Holocaust has to stop. The femicide has to stop. It's an emergency. Well, let's think about it in another way today. Today, if someone is murdered across the street from where we are right now, this is terrible. The police will come and there'll be an investigation, and if the murder rate goes up in Toronto, we'll all be saying, hey, there should be better laws, more police protection, what's going on? But if 100 million people are killed, this is different. We're no longer talking about things happen in a city. We're now talking about something on a scale that is so massive that we have to bring our attention to it. And what better time than in the 21st century? When we have the technology to be aware of it. Arthur C. Clarke wrote about this in the 1940s, which I thought was wonderful. He said the future of civilization is that there'll be no privacy. He said on the one hand, that may be awful. On the other hand, no dictator will go unnoticed. He predicted, he said, there'll be cameras as small as backpacks, and you'll be able to go to anywhere and be able to expose any atrocity as it's happening. And people thought he was crazy. But he addressed the United Nations in the 1940s and predicted these things. Well, now we're in a position where it's not just a question of social networking, it's a question of, can you have privacy anywhere in the world? Unfortunately, our privacy is being eroded. But the good news is, so is the privacy of people who are creating atrocities on a mass level. They can't hide. And that's part of your responsibility as a filmmaker. That's part of my responsibility as an activist. We only saw pictures of the Holocaust after the concentration camps were opened and people were freed. Before then, we just knew it has to be stopped. The pictures of what it looked like came out after they were liberated, not before. All we knew was people were being slaughtered. That's good enough. You don't need to know more than that.
Yeah.
On a mass scale.
I totally see what you're saying. I was just bringing it up because coming from the visual, emotional medium.
I understand that because as a person who tries to tell the story more and more, it's very easy to fall into that. Say, let me tell you about another woman. And that's why I always say, imagine a girl, imagine a woman. And can you say to her, this is not going to happen to you? As opposed to, let me tell you what happened to her. We know what happened to her. She was raped, she was mutilated, she was slaughtered, she was sold. We're done with this. It's enough. Yes, it's enough about the ozone layer, agreed. It's enough about homophobia, it's enough about sexism, it's enough our economic system has to change. Yes, all of these things are ongoing.
Yeah,
but the emergency that we deal with right now, look at the environment. We have to deal with the environment. But where there's an earthquake, we need to deal with that today, right now. And you can see that, again, talking about homophobia, same thing happened with AIDS. That the homosexual community, there is no homosexual community, but a community of people gathered around this in the 70s and 80s and 90s because this was growing into a Holocaust. And now people around the world are trying to deal with this in other countries where it is no longer contained and can be stopped because the numbers are staggering. Here, AIDS still is growing, but you can deal with it. It's not good, but you can deal with it. There are countries still where there are tens of millions of people dying of AIDS and there's no reason for it. When those numbers reach that point, you simply can't ignore it. It becomes a humanitarian issue that the whole world needs to think about in terms of security. We'll multiply that by 10, and that's what's happening to women. I'm not trying to defend women. Women do not need anybody to defend them. They're not weak. They don't need to be empowered. I think that's silly. They don't need to be defended. That's silly. But we need to draw an end. We need to draw a line and bring this to an end. And that's the stand that I take now because, well, it's over. And that's why I often say I'm not even outraged by it, because I know we helped to create it. We all have contributed to this. So I'm not going to lay blame even if it's deserved. I'm simply going to say it's over. But don't mess with me now that it's over. I'm saying we're done with this. We're done with it, and we won't allow it anymore.